There is not a day since probably July that I have not received some sort of a missive as to when is the great airlift of COVID-19 vaccine or vaccines going to start, and how many freighters and or planes will be required to carry said vaccines.
Hello and welcome to Back in Business, a new series brought to you by Arabian Business, exploring how various industries are spearheading their recoveries in the wake of COVID-19. In this episode, we'll be focusing on the air cargo market. Obviously, air freight has played a huge role in keeping supply chains running throughout the pandemic, and will continue to play a pivotal role in getting economies back on their feet once COVID-19 subsides. I'm joined here today by Tom Crabtree, Regional Director Marketing for Air Cargo at Boeing Commercial Airplanes, and Leonard Rodrigues, Head of Revenue Management and Network Planning at Etihad Cargo. Obviously, the air cargo market has been run absolutely ragged in recent weeks by a collapse in capacity. So how well do you feel operators are accommodating increased demand with severely reduced capacity?
Well, it's 6 months into the COVID-19 downturn that started. Actually, we all learned to say the coronavirus back in January of 2020. It's now the 15th. I have to look at the calendar, knowing it's only still the 14th here of September 2020. But things got really, I would say, frenetic in the first 2 weeks of March, when a number of lockdowns were progressively instituted throughout that month. And so what has happened is, in broad brush terms, there are 26,000 jet transports in the world, from regional jets to very large aircraft like 747, A380 size passenger capacity. Only 2,000 of those airplanes, out of less than 8%, are freighter aircraft. So what has happened is, given the fact that roughly in normal times, about 55 to 60% of capacity is provided by passenger lower holds or belly cargo, what we have seen is a market increase in the utilization and load factor on freighter aircraft, those remaining 2,000 or so airplanes that are cargo planes dedicated from the time they are built or modified into cargo airplanes. And we've seen airlines, particularly passenger airlines, modify or dedicate particularly their wide-body airplanes for what they call P-freighter use. And according to the statistics we're able to obtain from Cargofax Consulting, based out of Luxembourg, there are about 200 or so airlines that are using P-freighters to tune of about 2,400 aircraft that are passenger aircraft. Not all at once, but it's kind of varied depending on the market and the timing and the demand for personal protection equipment, which is largely Asia manufactured and centric. And of all the world's passenger airplanes that are flying today, which are still down dramatically compared to where they were just the first couple months of this year, roughly half are operating what we call normal mode, which means they are flying both passengers on the main deck and cargo downstairs or in the lower hold, or they're flying the other half is flying strictly in the form of P-freighters or cargo-only operations. Most of that means it's strictly in the lower hold. Less than 6 or 7% of these airplanes, passenger airplanes that are being used as P-freighters, are actually having the seats removed. So it's very much a wide-body centric maneuver at this point in time in terms of trying to deliver essential goods from origin to destination.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. And Leonard, speaking about these, passenger jet operations being, turned into cargo operations. Obviously, Etihad's cargo revenues have shot up by around 40% since COVID struck. How much of this is down to the huge spike in cargo fares that we've seen in recent weeks?
Well, for sure, the timeline that was offered by Tom is the timeline that we've all been living, which is we've had a pretty normalized Q1, and then suddenly around March, it all started becoming completely different. And indeed, it's not that air cargo volumes have surged, it's that the capacity has shrunk. So what we've seen in those cases is that freighter operators or combination carriers, which operate a combination of wide body and freighters, such as Etihad, are the ones that had the means to somehow address this, I would say, increase in demand related to the shortage of supply. So we've been operating a lot of those P freighters, which internally we've been calling the mini freighters. And so obviously our revenues have kind of increased because tonnage-wise it's reduced, but the amount of agility and care that you need for shipments that are related to both food security and medical aid in the form of PPE, protective equipment, flows requires you to be very agile and to basically dedicate an aircraft which traditionally only has 10-15% of its revenue cargo only for cargo. So the way to strike a balance is indeed through the higher yields, but the industry really required this capacity to be flown.
And this increase in cargo revenues, how long do you see this lasting? Will it stretch far beyond the pandemic?
I think nobody has a crystal ball, and obviously if I ask my finance, they would want it to continue for the next 5 years. But the reality that what we are seeing is it's very intrinsically linked to how fast the passenger travel resumes. So I would say it's a bit of a mixed message, because as long as our revenues are high on the cargo side, we can probably bet that the revenues are way too low on the passenger side. Essentially, what will normalize the revenue situation is when the passenger traffic will normalize and all the aircraft will be back in the air with traditional or close to the traditional balance in revenues between passenger revenue and the cargo revenue. So we know for sure that it's going to extend into 2021. We want to hope that it will normalize quickly, because the latest forecast from IATA saying that it could last as long as 2024 are not really encouraging for a combination carrier.
Yeah. And from an operator's point of view as well, how much support are you getting from both the manufacturers and regulators when it comes to transforming your passenger aircraft, into essentially cargo freighters temporarily?
Well, that's a very technical topic, so I'll give you my feedback on this, but you'll have to understand that I might not have all the words right. What we see is that there's a huge amount of facilitation. Usually when we start considering an idea, like whether it's removing the seats or strapping cargo into the seats, there's usually already been a bolt-in from the manufacturers. And the manufacturers have kind of worked with the regulators so that there's a quick approval process that can be made. And so it's, I would say everybody's really working around the clock to make sure that in the process, nothing unsafe gets done. And so we as a carrier would never have the initiative, I would say, to start carrying cargo in a way that the manufacturer or the regulator would have not approved. But we don't see this as the bottleneck. It is more about, I would say, the types of commodities, the demand for these services that is kind of difficult to forecast anyway. So when you look at it from an investment perspective, there are places where it makes sense and places where it doesn't make sense. But I would say facilitation is across the industry very smooth.
Okay. And Tom, if we can just talk about Boeing's aircraft specifically for a minute. So obviously Etihad and a number of other airlines have shown that the 787, for example, has played a strong role in carrying freight and keeping supply chains open in recent weeks. So can you see aircraft like the 787 having a bigger role to play in air freight beyond the pandemic?
Well, of course, but actually, citing the figures I brought up earlier, 2,400 airplanes, passenger airplanes being used as for cargo-only operations since the beginning of the pandemic. About 85-90% of them are wide-body aircraft led. We are proud to say, and yes, I am plugging my current employer. The 777 first, the 777-300ER in particular, and then the 787, followed by the A330 and the A350 as the four workhorses of sorts during this pandemic to augment freighter capacity, which is not adequate to meet total demand. And I just want to echo something that Leonard brought up, and that is, cargo is really in the spotlight right now because it's the only fully functional element of our world air transport system, but it is still down. We were actually starting to see, air cargo was actually contracting in 2019, well before COVID-19 occurred, down about 3% relative to really good year 2018 in terms of traffic growth. But we were starting to see a bit of recovery in January and February. Actually, February was not a bad month relative to February 2019. And then the bottom fell out. And by April, traffic was down, according to IATA statistics, roughly about 26% relative to April 2019, which was also not a good month. But by July of this year, traffic, the contraction had recovered to just only minus roughly 13.5%, according to IATA statistics, which if you think about it, the contraction halved in just roughly 4 months. So that gives you an idea of just how vital air freight is to the world, the functioning of our civilization.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, obviously now you would hope that governments are starting to see the vital importance of air freight to world economies. But, some airlines are still concerned about US and China trade wars and trade tensions. How do you feel that could impact on the recovery of the air freight industry?
Well, those tensions were in place long before COVID-19 became a commonplace feature of our everyday language. And we're seeing some offshoring of industries from coastal China already, as long ago as 5 years ago. And a lot of that was not necessarily due to the trade tensions that have occurred over the last several years, but also due to rising wages in coastal China. So we saw industry moving inland into China where wages were lower. We saw industry moving south to places like Vietnam and Indonesia and Cambodia, to a lesser extent Laos, Myanmar, even India. So industry is always on the move for the optimal labor and material input costs. And as a consequence, we who work in the air cargo industry will always be beneficiaries of that because we have to follow the supply chain.
Okay. And this question goes out to both of you. So the International Air Transport Association last week told the supply chain and governments to prepare to distribute a potential COVID-19 vaccine. So it described the task as the mission of the century for the air freight industry. So my question is, how prepared do you feel that the industry is to effectively distribute a vaccine when it comes to it?
I'll take that from my end first. At Etihad, we feel we're very prepared. We have already assembled what we call the COVID-19 workforce, which is a group of all the department heads that are going to be working on coordinating this response. And so on that respect, we've looked at everything, which is the assessments of the lanes where different scenarios of where the vaccine could come from, how it could be packaged. We've already engaged and somehow placed reservations, let's say, with the container companies. So we're pretty much, I would say, all set in how we are going to deliver the response. I think what is a bit unclear, and I think that's the reason why IATA makes a point of communicating early into it, is that there are, for example, the UAE response is going to be relatively easy to orchestrate because they have a major logistic player, which is us. They also have a second player in Dubai, which is a bit of a minor player, but is still there. So they could still very well find solutions. The difficulty is we're not too sure where some countries which do not have a large logistic player will decide to procure. So of course they can come to us, they can come to somebody else, but that share of the workload has to somehow be anticipated, because once we set up all our supply chain for the UAE and a few countries which are contacting us, it might be difficult towards the end to completely change that and include additional countries with similar timelines and incremental container requirements. So we're ready. It's going to be delivered very well, but for some places which do not have, like the UAE, the chance of having a great supply chain in place, I hope IATA will push these countries to coordinate and anticipate further, so that it is smooth everywhere, because that's essentially what we want to deliver, is a smooth response to the crisis.
And Tom, what's your global perspective on this?
There is not a day since probably July that I have not received some sort of a missive as to when is the great airlift of COVID-19 vaccine or vaccines going to start, and how many freighters and or planes will be required to carry said vaccines. The short answer, Joe and Leonard, is there are too many variables and unknowns at this point to put numbers around it. I have seen numbers from 1,000 777 freighters to a total of 12,000 freighters needed to distribute the vaccine. Now, recall earlier in the conversation, there's only 2,000 freighters right now, and neither Airbus nor Boeing can churn out cargo planes that quickly to meet that kind of demand. And it's a little more subtle than that. There's also, in a nutshell, where will the vaccine be produced? India, for example, which is a key market for Gulf carriers to fill their aircraft, is a big supplier of pharma product. In fact, it's one of the, I would say, of the countries in the world outside of Europe or North America, in terms of just one nation state, it's one of the biggest. But then again, vaccines in general tend to, is based on the statistics I've seen from like Citibank research, tend to be made in Europe. Furthermore, for big nation states and like the United States, or for economic blocs like the EU, what we're also seeing is that you can truck a lot of these vaccines. You don't need airplanes to distribute a lot of it, because you're in trucking markets where you have a contiguous land market. And I'm with Leonard. Nations that have ready-made logistics players and infrastructure will be well set. I'm more concerned about those countries that don't have that, particularly the developing world. It's a bit of a concern. So keep in mind, there's also the world container ship industry. Now, they're not as fast as our beloved airplanes. Trust me, I've checked. But there's also 2 to 3 million containers minimum out there on the world's container ship fleet that can handle refrigerated product. Now, can they handle the temperatures that are required for vaccines? I don't know. I have done a bit of research also on the containers that are required to handle or that are available for the temperature-controlled industry. And Leonard, you can confirm this for me as well. They tend to be mostly lower hold. You don't see a lot of full main deck containers that go to a full 2.6 or 3 meter height on a main deck freighter. It's mostly a lower hold device. So we will need the P freighters, we will need, and the freighters as well, to move the vaccine, in a nutshell. And it will, and to IATA's point, it will have to be a very coordinated effort. And the sooner it begins, the better.
So I think demand for air cargo among Middle East carriers saw the sharpest increase of any region between June and July, according to IATA's latest figures. So how do you view the fortunes of air cargo in this region specifically over the next year?
I would say, given the freighter fleets at the 4 major Middle East carriers, sorry, Leonard, not only Etihad Cargo, but also those good folks in Dubai, those good folks in Jeddah, and those good folks in Doha, are well set. And beyond, I would say, relative to the express carriers who, okay, of the 2,000 freighters I mentioned earlier in our chat, a little more than half, about 60% of them, 1,200 of them, are actually controlled by the express carriers. So the big household names of FedEx, UPS, DHL, and China SF. They're there, but the Middle East carriers have a very sizable hunk of world capacity, not only just in freighters, but also in twin aisle passenger airplane lower holds, which are very cargo capable, like the 777-300ER can carry. There was a little carrier down the road at Etihad, should know about, that carried about 65 metric tons earlier this year, and the lower hold of its 777-300ER from Pakistan into Dubai. So that's not an everyday occurrence. That's in fact, it's a very one-off event. But that does show the flexibility of passenger airplanes in terms of their ability to carry cargo.
Okay, and well, I think most people assume that technology will play a greater role in air cargo, and certainly will have a role to play in air cargo's recovery as well in the coming weeks and months. So what role do you think that technology, for example, IATA's one source platform, might have to play in the market's recovery?
Well, what we see at Etihad is that digitization is getting a lot of traction across all sorts of initiatives. It's always been kind of the number one value of our strategy for the past 2 to 5 years. And so what we see is that we were very active in that field, and we were getting some traction, but for sure with COVID, that traction has grown exponentially. So one source that you mentioned is getting a lot of interest, but One Record, which was also another IATA initiative, which seemed difficult to start, nearly 6 months ago, now has a lot of people supporting it. The airway bill numbers have never been higher, and the new types of booking platforms, whether they're the Freightos or the web cargo, the Cargo One platforms, what you can see is that the numbers are going up. So it's obvious that in a working from home environment, with all the restrictions that happen today to do sales visits, to do the normal way or the traditional way that we used to know how to do business until now, it is pushing digitization across all initiatives.
Okay. And Tom, from your perspective, how far has the explosion in e-commerce changed the air cargo market forever? Do you think we could ever return to normality, or has the market now changed beyond recognition and altered onto a different course?
Very loaded question, Joe, but I'll do my best. So suffice it to say, e-commerce has been a buzzword in our industry since I was relatively young, over 2 decades ago. I remember hearing about it as far back as 1998, when I was a pretty young analyst in the air cargo group at Boeing. The interesting thing is it seems to have really accelerated since roughly the 2014 or so timeframe. This was we noticed a pickup in traditionally moribund mail traffic volumes in statistics compiled by IATA and ICAO. And we dug a little deeper, and we found that a lot of e-commerce shippers were actually preferring to use the postal system to move consolidations of e-commerce movements. And so has it changed the industry? Oh, most certainly, especially during the pandemic, because that tends to be the way most consumers are getting goods now if they can't go to the shops. Will it probably change the nature of how our industry functions going forward? I think so. What's interesting is that the problem we have with e-commerce is that, look, the revenues per unit piece are relatively minor. They're relatively low. I have a running pithy question when Boeing executives ask me, what about e-commerce? I said, well, how much money does a transportation provider earn when shipping is free? So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. The volumes are very welcome, but the revenues are very light unless the consolidations are very dense. So as a consequence, what we have seen is that even some of the bigger e-commerce players have complained to us, Boeing, please help us. How can we make our shipments more dense so we get more revenue per unit weight on the pallet or in the container? So it depends. Yeah, it's very welcome volume. It has changed consumer patterns. That is beyond a doubt at this point in time. But what does it mean for long-term growth for the world industry? I'd say that the fill-up is probably in certain trade lanes as much as 50% faster than they were, say, 5-10 years ago. So if a trade lane was growing 3%, it'll grow 4.5% now. Long-term, I would say the next 5 to 10 years as e-commerce networks get stood up.
Okay.
Sure. I just want to add to Tom's reply, because maybe on this one we should change our business titles, because I'm going to make his advertisement. I think the impact is a bit deeper than what we see today, and I believe that I would say it's unfortunate, because I hope the price tag doesn't go up. That it just means that freighters will again play probably a higher role in the future, because what we tend to see is that indeed at the moment, because shipping has to be free to be commercially available on those web platforms, there's a lot of flexibility that is given to us by the shipper, just because they're trying to secure the lowest rate. However, once that lowest rate is not available, there's a real requirement for things to move in line with when the order has been conducted, which makes a lot of sense. You know, when you want to buy something online, you kind of want it to reach your home. You're not really clicking the button saying, well, free shipping, but you know, whenever it comes, it comes. So what we tend to see, and it's even a bigger scale than those platforms, is it increases volatility hugely. And so we go through cycles that are now completely accelerated. And so the non-e-commerce world, or the gateway consolidation world that we used to know before, was allowing us to plan our volumes for the next 6 months quite cleanly. Whereas now with e-commerce, we just need to react to what the demand is. And the people behind the e-commerce shippers sometimes themselves have completely no capability to predict what the order cycle is going to look like. So right now, as we speak, there's been a huge uptick in people buying garments online, I guess because the winter season is coming. I'm not an expert there, but the combination of the COVID situation, the fact that the sea freight is now not completely returned to normal and at a higher rate, is just creating some sort of clear frenzy for garment delivery back into Europe, back into the US. And so we're discussing huge contracts, which are much larger than what we used to negotiate at this moment in time for garment delivery. So I do believe that e-commerce, which we broadly see as the change of B2B from B2C type of cycle, is going to change the game, and it will reward the people that are able to flexibly change their capacity in line with what the demand is, which means that having freighters is kind of a great asset in this game. So maybe I'm making too much advertising for freighter purchases, but we do see that that's the reality.
Okay, and we'll end with a question from one of our viewers then. So Linus Bauer, who's the managing director of Bauer Aviation Advisory, he asks, and this goes to both of you really. So he asks, Etihad currently owns 10 Airbus A380s, and for the next 12 to 36 months, we assume the airline won't need any of them, or at least won't need all of them. So due to Abu Dhabi's excellent geographical location, would the A380 actually be a better freighter option for Etihad Cargo?
Ooh, that's a technical question. So obviously, I mean, the first part is I think clear. There's going to be a resumption of traffic, but you kind of only need the 380s on routes because it's the biggest aircraft. On routes that have reached a certain volume, there's really no point in putting a big aircraft if all the passengers would fit on a 787-9. So I think, yes, the premise of the question makes sense. We know that in the recovery line, which we can't predict completely, the 380s will be at the end of that line rather than at the beginning of that line. That's relatively clear. And so we know that, and Airbus knows that. So Airbus has been pitching ways to try to use the 380 as a P freighter. And I think Tom alluded to it, but at the moment it's not the case. If you look at the ones that have been used during the pandemic, it is not the 380s, because of course, there's a certain volume you have in the cabin, but there's also a certain size you have in your belly hold. And even though the 380 is a much bigger aircraft, the belly hold is not much bigger than, for example, the 787-10. So the fact that this additional advantage of the volume is just a complement, I would say, to the belly hold capability. So at the moment, we as Etihad, together with Airbus, have not identified. I'm not sure we're giving up, because as long as Airbus wants to entertain that conversation, we have to look into all the options. At this moment, we've not identified a solution that would improve the economics of the A380 as a freighter beyond what we're currently using.
And Tom, where do you stand on this? I know a couple of airlines, for example, Highfly, have converted their passenger A380s temporarily into cargo freighters. So where do you stand on that question?
Well, I would say that the more capable twin-engine airplanes that are available today from both Boeing and Airbus, to be fair, are the preferred P freighters. As I mentioned, in order, the 777, the 787, the A330, the A350 are the preferred P freighters. Quad jets are not as cargo friendly. They're not, as Leonard alluded to, and they're not as flexible. And loading cargo on seats on more than one deck, if you got two decks of a passenger airplane, it's already kind of labor intensive to load cargo on a solitary main deck of a airplane where you are using the passenger airplane solely as a cargo aircraft. So it's a bit challenging. And so longer term, yields have, and with the combination of the contraction capacity that we've seen with the reduction in passenger flying and the demand on freighter fleets, has led to extraordinary yields. And yeah, if you have to move personal protection equipment or relief supplies, any airplane will do when the yields are, say, $3, $4, $5 per kilo and higher.